Hurricanes Katrina and Rita heightened the need for emergency response plans around the country. Local officials claim to have a plan in place, but what is it? And does it allow for the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people, many of them tourists stranded without cars? We'll ask preparedness expert and State Senator Joe Heck next on Face to Face. Welcome to Face to Face. I'm Jon Ralston. An earthquake, a flu epidemic, a terrorist attack? Disaster can strike a city in any form at any time. Both 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina illustrated the need for cities to be prepared when disaster strikes. But what happens if a city or county needs to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people on a moment's notice? County, state, and city officials, even the governor, say they are prepared. But is it a moot point given that some catastrophes can strike without warning? Here to talk about emergency preparedness, State Senator and local physician Joe Heck. He owns his own consulting firm on emergency preparedness, and he's worked with private industry and local governments on the issue. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, John.
All right, let me ask you a very simple question. We've done several programs on this, and I've asked this same question, local officials and state officials, including the governor. Is this valley prepared in the event of a catastrophe occurring here?
Well, I think we're as prepared as any other jurisdiction throughout the country, and I think it comes down to how you define catastrophe. And what we've seen with Katrina is that not all catastrophes are similar to each other, and this one was certainly the most significant event we've seen in the United States. So if you look at what types of catastrophes we need to be prepared to handle locally, I think that through the state and the local emergency planning process, we're very prepared.
What makes you say that? Why? I mean, you sound confident. Is that Joe Heck, the private guy who's worked with local governments and in the private sector and understands this, or is this Joe Heck, the politician who says, I got to say we're prepared? Seriously.
No, seriously, I think that we are very well prepared, primarily through a lot of the work that I've done around the country where I've seen the preparedness plans and I've participated in other jurisdictions' exercises, and I've seen how other areas are prepared and what they plan to do should they be faced with some type of a catastrophe. And then likewise, I've worked on the plans here locally, and I work with the local emergency planning committee and all the emergency managers throughout the valleys, and so I know that comparatively speaking, we are very well prepared.
I don't think people really have a sense of what these plans are like and what goes on. Is this just doing running scenarios, worst case scenarios, what might happen, what would we do in the case of certain things, and having certain procedures in place? Is that really what's happened?
Well, it's a constant process. The plans are always in evolution, and in Clark County we've had an all hazards approach to emergency planning for over a decade.
What does that mean, all hazards approach?
It means that you look at preparing to respond to anything along similar lines, and so that you have a base plan that says how you're going to respond to anything regardless of what it is. And then there's an annex that talks about specific types of catastrophes. And this all hazards approach is something that's new for the federal government. That's something that they just started using back in 2003 when the President released Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 5. So compared to the federal government, we've been way ahead of the power curve in that we've used this approach for a decade. And we have our base plan. We exercise it frequently. We use different scenarios. After every exercise, we look at lessons learned. We'll look at what happened in Katrina and Rita and take their lessons and see if there's anything there that's applicable to our plans that we need to change. But the plan is not a static document. It's a living document that changes as we get new technology, as we face new threats, and so it's an ever ongoing process.
The interesting question to me, and I've talked to others about this on this program, including the governor, is whether a mass evacuation here would be possible. We're in the middle of nowhere, not too many ingresses and egresses out of Las Vegas. The governor on the program said it's nearly impossible to prepare for a widespread evacuation. Let me show you what he had to say.
There is no solution for us to say how we're going to get 1,500,000 or 600,000 people out of this valley under a control factor with an unannounced catastrophe. It just isn't going to happen. So most people, in my own case, I would just hunker down where I was because most of us would know there's a couple of roads out north and south, and there's a couple of small roads out east and west, and outside of that, that's about it.
You know, not everyone's going to have that attitude, though, or be as calm as the governor says he would be. You know, you have certain instances here, Senator, people are going to go crazy. They're going to panic. Sure. They're going to try to get out of town. What do you do in that situation?
Well, you know, and I think it comes back down to the question of, is there a need for an evacuation versus is there a desire for an evacuation? And certainly those, the layperson, the person who's the tourist on the Strip who hears something on the news that may have occurred, is going to try to get out of town as quickly as possible. It's just a natural reaction. But is it a necessary reaction to protect life and preserve health? That's the question. And I think when we look at the threats that the Valley faces and the hazards analysis that have been done, it is highly unlikely, I mean, so remote that we would ever actually have to have a mass evacuation. But you're right, with basically 4 ingresses and egresses out of the Valley, it would be difficult. And in 2003, we participated in Determined Promise exercise. It was a Department of Defense exercise, largest exercise they had ever done to date, and we were the host city for it. And part of it was a plague release that was on the Strip. And as the plan evolved, we saw that through the play that I-15 southbound was jammed bumper to bumper. And so how do you do that? How do you handle it? It is very difficult, and
there's no way to handle it. There isn't. There is no way to, unless you're going to build a bunch of other roads out of this town, which doesn't seem feasible to me.
You can't handle it reactively. We have to be proactive to educate at least the residents that live in Clark County about what our plans are and what the need for an evacuation may or may not be. The tourist population, we've worked very closely with the hotels, the Security Chiefs Association for the Strip resorts, on how they would handle their personnel as well as their guests, should we need to either move them to another facility or if we need to make sure that they stay at the facility where they're located.
But I guess the difference here is, but what you've mentioned this before and so have others, the need for an evacuation, mass evacuation, against the desire. There are a lot of people, they're not going to care. They're going to react viscerally. They see a news report of a bubonic plague being sprayed in the Strip. They're going to just rush to get out of town, even though that may not be the smartest or the best thing to do. You can't do anything about that, can you?
You're exactly right. I mean, people that are going to want to self-evacuate will find a way to self-evacuate. And if I-15 southbound is bumper to bumper, they'll start cutting across the desert. There is no way to have that type of evacuation out of our valley. Fortunately, as I stated, when we look at our hazards and our vulnerabilities, we don't foresee a need to actually have to move people, and that's where I'm concerned. My concern is there's 500,000 people that we need to move out of the valley. Can we do it? Fortunately, for our scenarios, we don't see a need where we would ever have to move 500,000 people out of the valley.
When we come back, let's talk about the opposite problem, too, which is the need to keep people here, a possible quarantine situation. A lot of people think public health hazard could be the biggest threat that we're facing. Let's talk about that when we come back. Back with State Senator Joe Eck. He's a local physician and he's an expert on disaster preparedness when Face to Face returns.
Watching Face to Face with Jon Ralston.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking to State Senator Joe Eck. He's also an expert in disaster preparedness. He's worked with local governments and private folks on this issue for many, many years. He's giving us his expertise. What would happen if a disaster struck this valley? We just saw Dr. Dale Carrison go into the break saying some things. He says a big problem that could arise in the event of a disaster would be people refusing to evacuate. Here's what he told the Review Journal. Some residents will say, no, I'm not leaving. Now, at what point can I remove you from your house? That depends on if you're under martial law or not. Most people will evacuate, but what do you do with the subset of people who won't? There's that simple question raised there, Senator, but there's also the question that's come up in the wake of Katrina and Rita, which is, what about the possibility of federalizing the entire disaster zone, Department of Defense, Pentagon being involved? What are the possibilities of that happening, do you think?
Well, I think that in the wake of Katrina, it's more likely to occur. Now, while being a firm proponent of the 10th Amendment and states' rights, we have to realize that any individual state will never have the resources and capability that the federal government has. And in certain overwhelming catastrophic occurrences like we saw in Katrina, it may come to the point where instead of waiting for the governor to request resources as is required by the Stafford Act, that the federal government comes in and says, we need to take control now to protect life, preserve property, and maintain government.
Let me just stop you for a second there and go back to something you said in the first segment. And this is what a lot of people think in the wake of these disasters, which the federal government is not nearly as well prepared to handle these kinds of things as some of the states are, including Nevada. That could be a real problem, right? Well,
there's a difference between being prepared and then having the resources to be able to execute a plan in some overwhelming catastrophe. And certainly I would believe, and I've seen, that the locals and the states are probably better prepared at responding. But there's going to come a point where their resources are tapped, as we've seen in any number of disasters, and the federal resources come in. What I propose and what I think needs to happen is we need to speed up that process and not necessarily keep it on a governor's request for federal resources. Certainly the federal government knew that they were going to be needed down in the Gulf. They pre-positioned resources in the area, but they couldn't go into the state until those resources were requested by the governor. And so they were 24 to 48 hours behind the response right off the bat.
And you would hope that in the wake of what happened there and all the adverse publicity that they've improved that and actually get people appointed ahead of these agencies who know what they're doing. That's a different topic. But let's talk about what might happen in Las Vegas. We're not going to have a hurricane here. Yeah, we might have an earthquake. But let's look at what the top threats are facing Las Vegas. Here's what a recent study showed by Southern Nevada emergency officials. Biggest threat is a flu or viral epidemic. It's followed by flash floods, wildfires, drought, earthquakes, and floods. And Jim O'Brien, who's the Clark County Emergency Management Director, says he's more concerned about tourists than terrorists. The #1 hazard we face is public health hazards because we have people coming here from all over the world who bring their bugs with them. We've had outbreaks of things here before. We've had Legionnaire's disease. Luckily, we didn't have SARS. But the president this week at his news conference talked about avian flu, which people are worried about now. How big a threat is a public health disaster happening here?
Well, I would agree with Mr. O'Brien, and I would certainly be most concerned about a public health threat, and not a terrorist release of a biological agent, but a naturally occurring outbreak, similar to potentially the pandemic flu of 1918, where tens of millions of people died throughout the world. And as we saw in 2003 with the SARS virus, and again, fortunately, it didn't make it here, but we saw that from one individual, that virus was spread to over 10 countries, responsible for 22 deaths and thousands of people becoming ill. So with the tourist destination that we are, people coming from all over the world here to Las Vegas, it's very possible that we will see some unknown bug that will spark an outbreak here in our valley.
Have we just been lucky so far? I mean, are we just lucky that SARS didn't come here? I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, there are people all over the world coming here, and whether someone's going to come here intentionally to spread a bug or that just accidentally happens. What kind of procedures can you have in place?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we didn't see SARS is that we have a very finely tuned public health machine here in Southern Nevada. And we were receiving visitors from Asia during the time of the SARS outbreak, but the public health infrastructure that we have and the public health department was able to set up arrangements to actually visit with these people as they were coming off the plane, interview these people, find out whether or not they had been in an area where they may have been exposed, and had somebody been exposed, that person then would have been taken aside and offered medical treatment and evaluated to see whether or not they posed a risk to the community. So I think from a biological standpoint, we're very well prepared because we have a very adept public health department. And now we also have a public health laboratory in Southern Nevada. The first, we were the only major metropolitan area without a public health laboratory within 100 miles. We now have one, state of the art, so we can take care of the things that happen locally.
But in the SARS case, as you mentioned, we were on alert. Everyone was on alert. What about just something coming through? I mean, they're not having people coming off planes from Asia or from anywhere else. It could come from anywhere. I mean, that's not going on now. What can you do?
Well, the thing is, it goes back to education, and here it's education of the healthcare community, which we are very active in making sure that when healthcare providers see the phrases, if you think see unusual, think outbreak. So that if you're seeing the 2-3 individuals coming into your office or your emergency department that have an unusual presentation that you haven't seen before, or even something that you think it might be a common cold, but there's something different about it, that we want that reported to the health department so that we can become involved much more quickly and evaluate the potential threat.
When we come back, I want to, since you brought that up, let's talk about the issue I raised earlier, which is what if there's a possible quarantine? Can that be imposed? How do you impose something like that, and how long might it last? Let's talk about that. Back with Joe Heck. He's a state senator and local physician who's an expert on the issue of disaster preparedness. Let's face it, there's so much chaos out there, it's almost impossible to tell fact from fiction. If you're sick and tired of politicians spinning this and spinning that, you've got to watch my show.
Face to Face with Jon Ralston, only on Las Vegas 1.
Face to Face is brought to you in part by Community Bank of Nevada, a business bank where personal service is our priority. Community Bank of Nevada. Bank on it.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I'm Jon Ralston. We're talking about something that's on everybody's mind in the wake of the hurricanes and 9/11, and that is disaster preparedness. Is this valley prepared? We're talking to an expert, that's State Senator and local physician Joe Heck. All right, let's talk about the opposite problem, and you might have it. Public health hazard, you're going to want to stop people from leaving because everyone else in other cities in California and the surrounding area are not going to want people afflicted with avian flu or anything else from getting out. Do you think we can do that?
Well, I think it'll be very difficult to do that, especially since we have the large tourist population, which really is an unaccounted for population at any given time. Again, during the exercise I mentioned previously, Determined Promise, we did exercise what we call public health protective postures. We try to get away from the quarantine word because of the fear that it invokes. And we were able to effectively institute a phased approach, at least in the exercise, to trying to keep those people who may have been exposed here in the valley to provide medical care. Fortunately, when you look at the cases where we may need to do that, there's really only two diseases that are communicable, contagious person to person, that being plague or smallpox. So those are the scenarios that we're running where we look at public health protection and trying to keep those that may have been exposed or are actually infected here in the valley.
You know, it's interesting because you're going to have kind of a tension going on, you would think, between some of the people who are the heads of the tourist industry, whether it's a convention authority or people who are head of these strip hotels, who don't want massive outbreaks of bad publicity, if you will. Do you think these guys are sensitive enough to that, or do you think there's going to be an attempt to clamp down on some of this information?
No, we've had an excellent working relationship with the resort industry, again, specifically with the security chiefs associations, which have been very proactive in helping us formulate the plans and how the resorts will actually come into play when we need to put our plan into actual use. And so they're very involved. And we hope that the way we've planned it and the way we exercise it will be the way it happens should we ever need it.
What about resources? I mean, you're a guy who's been able to look at this from someone who's an expert in this and talks about it, but also as a legislator. Does the state, does the city, does the county have enough resources to deal with these kinds of problems?
Well, you know, it depends on which type of resource. When we look at medical infrastructure, obviously we're I think, inadequate, only because we don't have enough infrastructure to meet our daily needs at this point in time. But there are programs in place that we've started to initiate to help provide surge capacity for that overwhelming number of patients that may show up at any given time. The Hospital Association, Nevada Hospital Association, received a grant and purchased 2 deployable hospital units that can be set up anywhere in the state if necessary. And in fact, they're right now in Mississippi. The Department of Health and Human Services requested them for Katrina relief. We've exercised them, we used them, they worked great. This was the first time they were actually deployed and utilized, and they are receiving rave reviews. So we're happy that we have that capability. We look at trying to tap into other resource pools. Would we go to the National Guard and ask for their medical personnel to come and help staff? But the issue there, and what we found in the past, is those individuals will probably be personally affected by any disaster. And it's hard to call those people in to start providing care when they're worried about their own families and taking care of themselves. And we saw that down in Louisiana during the hurricane. So medically speaking, it will be behind the power curve, but I think we're prepared to be able to handle the first 24 to 48 hours, hopefully to the point where we start getting some federal assistance.
Let me show you what one county commissioner had to say about preparedness. And the reason I'm going to bring this up is because you can't talk about disaster here now without the specter of Yucca Mountain being raised, and what if nuclear waste does start coming here. Let me show you what Commissioner Myrna Williams had to say.
We are prepared, and we have better judgment than was exercised in the Gulf and at the federal level. I mean, how do you put somebody in charge of FEMA for a national disaster when you haven't even considered a worst-case scenario? I will tell you, that's what DOE is doing with Yucca Mountain.
And I guess the issue that this raises to me is not just with Yucca Mountain, but the whole question of the unknown. You can run all the scenarios that you want, and you know a lot about this, but you have to acknowledge that there's some things that you and I could not think of if we sat here all day. And I guess there's just nothing you can do about that, right?
Well, you know, when you look, again, going back to scenarios, and right now there's a series of 15 scenarios that the federal government, with outside input, has put together as the planning scenarios. And if you were to see that list, you're probably going to cover everything that we need to be prepared for. It runs from a 10-kiloton nuclear explosion down to a cyber attack, and everything in between as far as terrorism and natural disasters are concerned. So yes, it's been a slow process since September 11th, when all of a sudden there was a renewed emphasis on emergency preparedness. But we are making headway. We are making gains. Every exercise looks at another scenario. We try to better our plans and become better prepared for the hopefully never occurring event that we'll need to utilize them.
One of the issues that we talked about with other elected officials, and I know you're concerned about, is the whole issue of communication with the public, doing some kind of public education campaign. Some of the local officials talked about this. The public is already itself getting more and more aware of it because of what happened with Katrina. You know, but you can't just go and get a bunch of water and store it. There's more you have to do. What is the most important thing that local and state government can communicate to the public about what's going on?
Well, I think it's to be prepared, but to not be afraid. I think that's the big thing, is that you need to be able to be able to prepare to respond to any type of disaster that may occur. But you have to understand the true ramifications of that disaster, and don't let the fear factor take control where we have a million people cramming I-15 trying to get out of the valley. You know, September was National Preparedness Month, and that was planned even before Katrina. And the Clark County Health District, as part of that, started their Can It campaign. You may have seen it, where they sent out flyers and did some promo spots on the air about how to make a home preparedness kit, so that in the event you'd be able to take care of yourself for 24 or 48 hours. In the event it would take that long for somebody to get to you and help you. And that's just it. It's around public education. We've done a lot of work at preparing our responders. We've done a lot of work at educating our healthcare community and our public officials. Now we've got to put the emphasis on educating the public.
All right, Senator Heck, you've done your part today. I really appreciate your coming on the program.
My pleasure, John. Thanks.
All right. When we come back, we'll take a look at some of your feedback for recent editions of Face to Face.
You're watching Face to Face with Jon Ralston.
Welcome back to the program. Let's take a look at some feedback now from our callers. After watching our interview with Governor Kenny Gwinn, one viewer voiced his concern about the state's record tax increase in 2003. Did they really run that thing through the Constitution last year between the governor, the legislature, and the Supreme Court? They violated our Constitution just so they could raise taxes to give teachers a raise, and then we end up with a surplus just about as much as they raise taxes. Don't you think you ought to ask some hard questions and be thinking about that? There were a lot of questions raised about that, and of course the Supreme Court decision eventually became irrelevant because why? They got 2/3 of the vote for that tax increase. An unnamed caller had a lot to say about alleged sexual abuse of students in Clark County schools. With 3 weeks into the school system and with one teacher extradited for involuntary manslaughter, now you have 2 teachers molesting children. I guess no one's going to call attention to this until it happens to one of your children. Then maybe you'll have the guts to ask the DA why he has the audacity to plea bargain with these people. I guess I will sit here and wish that it happens to one of your children. Then maybe you'll do something about it. Now, isn't that a nice sentiment that's out there? Of course, we've asked the DA about this, and of course it is a problem in the school district, but that was a fairly nasty sentiment, don't you think? If you want to contact me, you can email me at ralston@vegas.com, or you can call me at 650-1976. You can also click on the Las Vegas Sun's website for the latest schedule updates, or on the KLAS website to catch the program in streaming video on the web. Or there's one more website, ralstonflash.com. On the next Face to Face, are Nevada's prisons releasing inmates too early, and is the state properly supervising its parolees? Find out on the next Face to Face.